Welcome back to Book Club, and Happy New Year to all of you. Today we are starting off with our Agatha Christie selection, which is The Murder of Roger Ackroyd. This was written in 1926, and it is the fourth of Christie's Hercule Poirot books, and it is widely considered to be her masterpiece. So, when we come back. Is with us today. He is sound asleep right behind me, and he's pushing his little nose right up against my butt because he's determined to share my seat. Crazy little cat. And who knows, he may decide he's going to come slinking around before we're through. Well, we are looking now at two writers who were writing a good 70, 80 years apart. Agatha Christie, who is one of the best-known mystery writers in the world, one of the greatest-selling mystery writers. And we are looking at her magnum opus. This is the best of her work. And it's The Murder of Roger Ackroyd. She wrote this in 1926. We are also going to take a look at Kerry Greenwood, who is an Australian writer who's written the Phryne Fisher mysteries that were set in the same period, the 1920s. And Greenwood's work is set in Melbourne, Australia. Christie's work is set largely in the UK, although with something like 75 novels plus plays and short stories. Some of her work has been set up all over Europe and North Africa. But the work that we're looking at now, The Murder of Roger Ackroyd, is one of her works in the sort of country house murder mystery that she really excelled at. And although today, in the 21st century, when we think of English country house murder mysteries, we think of Agatha Christie. And frankly, when I think of British mysteries in general, this is what I think of. The whole family just, crowded together in the English country house, and everybody's got their secrets, and the secrets are unraveling. This was Agatha Christie who created that archetype. The Murder of Roger Ackroyd is narrated by Dr. Shepherd, who is the next-door neighbor of Hercule Poirot, who is a retired Belgian detective of great note in his home country. He's apparently gone off to England in his retirement at this point. As I said, it was the fourth of her Poirot novels. And since it was written in 1926, this was fairly early in her career because she had a long career. So when we look at The Murder of Roger Ackroyd, a lot of what we see, looking at it from our vantage point, which is almost 100 years after it was written, we tend to see a lot of familiar tropes and stereotypes and so on. it's important to remember that the reason these are so familiar to us is because we're looking at Christie, who invented this. So Shepard is narrating the work, and he's telling us the story of uh, Roger Ackroyd, the local squire in their village, who has been mysteriously murdered. Excuse me. It's the classic sort of locked room mystery. Somebody's dead, the door is locked, who came in, how did they get in and out? Everybody ostensibly has an alibi, etc. Locked door mystery. Roger Ackroyd has been murdered. We find out that the relatively comfortable widow of someone who has died, another of the local squires, I guess, has recently killed herself. Her husband, who was apparently quite a scoundrel, has died under mysterious circumstances. And we learn very early on that Mr. Ferris, who is dead before the book even begins, was likely murdered by his wife. There seems, that's not a spoiler. We're told very early on that he has died. It's largely suspected that his wife killed him, and this is why she committed suicide. Apparently, Mrs. Ferris was secretly engaged to Roger Ackroyd, and these would have been two middle-aged, a widow and a widower who have gotten together. And as the novel unfolds, we see the interrelationships. We have a lot of good suspects. Most of our cast of characters will benefit from the death of Roger Ackroyd in one way or another. Mostly it's financial, who had the most to gain. And the chief suspect is Ackroyd's stepson, who is missing. He's out of the picture, and as the primary beneficiary of Ackroyd's will, he's the one with the most to gain. He's also the one we see the least, at least of the major suspects. He is an off-to-the-side character. We hear about him, other people's impressions, but we don't really interact with him. Primarily, we interact with our narrator, Dr. Shepard, who has a lot of information, a lot of access, and he tells us what Poirot is doing to unravel the case. Now, at this point, as I say, we're looking at this almost 100 years after this particular book was written, and certainly at least 100 years after Christie published her first Poirot novel, which I believe was 1920. So that was 100 years ago. So Hercule Poirot is a familiar figure, a fussy little Belgian detective with a bald head and an enormous mustache and an ego the size of Nairobi. It is I, Hercule Poirot. You cannot hide anything from me. I am the most brilliant detective in the world. And he is an interesting character, and Christie wrote him well, because as and completely out of control egomaniac, it would be normal for us to say, this is a very unattractive character. He's like so full of himself But he's charming, and he's a good detective, and he puts things together very well. So since we're going to have 2 weeks to deal with this, I'm not going to go any further in terms of explaining the plot. Some of you may not have even begun reading it yet. So for those of you who have not begun, last week I left a link in the pinned comment. That is the first comment in the list of comments. I pinned it so it would stay on the top. And you can get a PDF version of the book online. So if you haven't acquired it already, just go to that link, download it, and you can read it on your smartphone or your computer or your Kindle or whatever. But it's a very, very widely accessible book that should in fact be available in used paperback copies for almost nothing. And that's one of the things just throughout our little book club adventure that I have been trying to do to make sure all of the books are either available on PDF for free. Just go to the link, download it, it's yours. Or at a very reasonable cost, and that's for the more modern books, used through Amazon. I've tried to make sure that copies are widely available for under $10. And keep in mind that all of these books should be available through your local library as well. So if you haven't gotten your copy yet, download the PDF, check out your local library. The Murder of Roger Ackroyd is something that you should have just common and ordinary access to, because it's certainly one of the most popular and best known of all the murder mystery fiction out there. So what do we want to talk about with this? Now, in the past, when we've talked about things like Jane Austen, I've mentioned a lot about the environment in which the novels are set. In Austen's case and in Christie's case, this is the environment in which the novels have been written, as well as the setting. So when Austen was writing Pride and Prejudice, Sense and Sensibility, Persuasion, whatever, she was writing them as if they happened contemporaneously in her own time frame, in her own country, in her own backyard, pretty much, because much of her work is set in places like Bath, where she lived. Christie, these books, and The Murder of Roger Ackroyd in particular, is set in the English countryside and set in the 1920s. So this is her own era. And a lot of the things that we encounter may come as surprises to us. For example, the widespread use of telephones. This is 1926. Well, Christie is setting her works in England, even though it's rural. It's among the gentry. The people she is writing about are financially comfortable. The owners of big country houses, or in the case of our narrator in The Murder of Roger Ackroyd, a doctor. These are people who have telephones in their homes. These are people who have servants. She is not writing about poverty-stricken people in inner city London, for example, where it's entirely possible they may have gone their entire lives without ever having used a telephone. So that is number one, widespread telephones, widespread motor cars. Um, that was one of the things I found interesting about this, that Christie, when she is writing about these people, everybody seems to have a car. In reality, in 1920s in the UK, the wealthy had cars, but the country people had horses and carriages. Cars were still something of a novelty. And I found that interesting. One of the reasons that I know a lot about this particular era is because this is the era of my grandmother and my great aunt. And I was very close to both of them as a child. So I'm very familiar with how people lived. And they would tell me that going down the street, there would be cars, automobiles, side by side with horses and wagons. Interestingly enough, I can remember as a child in the 1950s still seeing horses and wagons from time to time. So it's not that, well, I know I'm not young, but it's not that far in the distant past. But Christie's characters as wealthy people had phones, they had cars, they had servants. And this is what she was writing about. So in some ways, her novels seem a little more modern to us than they might if she had been writing about the ordinary, average, working class Brit at the time. Now, this is the country squire and the doctor and the world-famous detective and so on and so forth. So they are at the top levels of the economics of the time. And keep in mind that you could be in the top 1% and still not be fabulously wealthy, because the vast majority of wealth in the UK was concentrated in a very, very tiny percentage at the very top. So what are we talking about? We're certainly not talking about average people. We are, even when it comes to the servants that she's talking about, these are not average people. These are people who are living in grand mansions. Yes, they are working there. Still, they are living in grand mansions. They have hot and cold running water available to them. There are telephones. They're living the good life. It also, I suppose, is an interesting digression, strikes me as explaining why going into domestic service must have been extremely attractive to people at that time, because it certainly did give you a pretty high standard of living compared to most people. Yes, it wasn't your house, but to live on a great estate with all of those luxuries and comforts available to you must have been infinitely preferable to factory work. That actually was not true in the U.S. In the U.S., factory work was considered preferable to domestic service. So we've got a different situation too. And by the way, that is largely because of our lack of strong class divisions. In the UK, right up until essentially the beginning of the Second World War, the class divisions were very, very strong. There was a glass ceiling. If you were not from the wealthier classes, you could only rise just so high before bumping your head against that glass ceiling that said, if you didn't go to the right school, what they call public schools, what we call private schools, you just weren't getting any higher. Didn't matter how capable you were, didn't matter how hard you worked, bang, hit the ceiling. In the US, you could be some you could be from the lowest background and still rise to the top because of our lack of strong class division. That's New World versus Old World. Yeah, basically that's just what it is. Their class structure had been in place for, 2,000 years. So it's very hard to buck 2,000 years of history. Our lack of class division had been around virtually since the beginning of our country. So it was easier for us. We look at things like Horatio Alger. That was a series of books about this hardworking, poor little boy who just makes it to the top. That's just the way it is. So for them, it's very different. So we're looking at a world that had not changed socially in a long time, but it was beginning to change. So having said all that, there is something that I do have to point out. And it had been a long, long time. I don't think I had read The Murder of Roger Ackroyd since I was a teenager until I recently reread it in preparation for book club. And I had not realized that there was a very objectionable passage. Short, we're talking about, I think, 2 lines, still has to be dealt with. And that is the anti-Semitism in Christie's work. Yeah, that was highly prevalent at the time. This is a world that had some very unpleasant stereotypes about Jews and absolutely no reservations about making them public. So at one point, and I believe this is, I'm trying to remember what it was. I think it was when I think it was when Roger Ackroyd's sister-in-law, was either his sister-in-law or his dead fiance, who is talking to our narrator, Dr. Shepard, about getting bills, requests for payment for past due debts. And she says they have come from people with Scottish names, which of course just plays right into the tight-fisted Scot stereotype. And then he says, well, there's probably some Semitic blood in there too. Again, Jews and money lending. And this is not the only, this was, like I said, this was small, but very offensive. In other works, I don't recall offhand what it was, but another one of her major works, she has a fence, a purveyor of stolen goods, who is initially introduced as a Greek, who in fact turns out to be a Greek Jew. Naturally, he's a Jew. He's fencing stolen goods. She portrays Italians as wild-eyed, dagger-wielding cutthroats, dagger-wielding, don't know where I got that from, dagger-wielding cutthroats. Everyone from Chicago is on a first-name basis with Al Capone. Some of her stereotypes are really appalling. The stereotypes of Americans as just pushy, obnoxious, ill-mannered people. If they have money, they're nouveau riche. It's just, you really see a lot of that. that the whole anti-American stereotype comes out very strongly in Murder on the Orient Express, where half her cast of characters are American, and they are all just appalling, disagreeable people. So her personal prejudices really come through strongly. I'm not prepared to give her a pass, not by a long shot, but I am going to say that at the time when she was writing her works, which was 100 years ago, her audience would not have even batted an eyelash at some of these inappropriate stereotypes that she was throwing out there. In fact, it probably would have resonated with their own mental picture of what is a Scot, what is a Jew, what is an American, what is an Italian. But it does, as I say, it has to be thrown out there that, no, I'm not giving her a pass. I'm not, because I do find it very offensive. But in her defense, I will say that she was far from the only person to harbor these views and witness the fact that her audience was not offended. So, fortunately for us, in looking at Roger Ackroyd, it's just one or two lines, and that's about it. Where I find a lot of more subtle prejudices is when she starts speaking about the servants. And so, well, it's typical of their class to be ghoulishly interested in a murder. Well, it's typical of their class to be gossiping. There's definitely that sort of looking down her nose at a lot of people that she clearly considers beneath herself and beneath the characters she's writing about. She is writing about the affluent. She was herself from the affluent classes. And when she starts writing about the servant classes, it's not with a great deal of kindness. So keep that in mind. And it doesn't hurt to be mindful of that. These are just her prejudices coming out. And, well, you take it for what it's worth. So we are going to continue with The Murder of Roger Ackroyd next week. This is a quick and easy read. I actually read a print copy of this over the weekend. And believe me, I do not read print copies of anything easily. So if I could get through it in 2 days, we're talking an easy read. But we're going to take a look at this because, let's face it, we all have lives and we're in the middle of a holiday. So we're going to finish this up next week. And then the following week, we're going to go on to Carrie Greenwood. And Carrie Greenwood, a modern Australian writer, setting her novels in the same time period. What I hope you have a chance to do is take a look at some of the differences, because you're not going to see the same degree of racial or ethnic prejudice in Greenwood's work. You are not going to see the same looking down one's nose at the servant class. So it's just good to keep that in mind, because we are reading these as companion pieces. The Murder of Roger Ackroyd by Agatha Christie, followed by Cocaine Blues by Carrie Greenwood. So just a chance to take a look because it's nice to be able to pull out some similarities along with some differences. All right, have a great day. Enjoy your New Year's Eve. Apparently, they're going to drop the ball in New York, as they do every year. Times Square, ball comes down. But, you got to ask yourself, the old thing, expression, if a tree falls in the forest and nobody's there to hear it, doesn't make a sound. If the ball drops in Times Square and nobody's there to watch it, is it really New Year's? All right, I will see you all tomorrow morning, and we're just going to back into our normal videos. Have a great evening. Happy New Year, and I can't tell you how pleased I am to be saying goodbye to 2020.